What if the difference between a civilization that lasts 1,000 years and one that collapses in a single generation has nothing to do with the size of its army, the height of its walls, or the gold in its treasury? Across 6,000 years of human history, empires with unmatched military power have crumbled into dust, while smaller, humbler societies have left legacies that still shape how we think, govern, and build today. Rome fell. Egypt endured for 3 millennia. The Maya cities went silent in the jungle. The Song dynasty flourished in science while its neighbors floundered in war. So what is it, really, that separates greatness from mere size? What invisible architecture holds a civilization together long after its founders are gone? To answer that question, we have to look past the monuments and the battles, into the quieter forces that decide whether a society becomes a footnote or a foundation for everything that follows. Every civilization begins with a wager against geography. Long before there were kings, laws, or written words, human survival was dictated by rivers, soil, and climate. And the earliest societies that mastered these forces became the first candidates for greatness. The Nile Valley is perhaps the clearest example in the historical record. Ancient Egypt did not rise because its people were more clever than their neighbors in the surrounding deserts. It rose because the Nile flooded with almost mathematical regularity, depositing rich black silt across the floodplain every year. This predictability allowed early Egyptians to plan agricultural cycles with a precision that was nearly impossible elsewhere in the ancient world. Surplus grain meant that not everyone had a farm. For the first time, a portion of the population could become scribes, priests, artisans, and administrators, the scaffolding of complex civilization. Historians and archaeologists studying the pre-dynastic period, roughly before 3100 BCE, have found that this agricultural surplus directly correlates with the emergence of centralized authority, culminating in the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, traditionally associated with the ruler Narmer. Mesopotamia tells a related but distinct story. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, floods were far less predictable and often violently destructive, which forced early Sumerian communities to develop something Egypt did not need as urgently: large-scale cooperative infrastructure. Irrigation canals had to be dug, maintained, and defended collectively, and this necessity for coordination is one of the leading explanations historians give for why Sumerian city-states like Uruk and Ur developed some of the earliest known systems of law, bureaucracy, and writing. Cuneiform script, emerging around 3400 to 3200 BCE, was not born from philosophical ambition. It was born from the mundane need to track grain shipments, canal labor, and tax obligations. Greatness, in other words, often begins as bookkeeping. Geography's influence extends far beyond rivers. Consider the difference between civilizations bordered by natural barriers and those left exposed on open plains. Ancient China's early dynasties, particularly the Shang and Zhou, developed within a landscape partially shielded by mountains, deserts, and vast distances from other major population centers. This relative insulation gave Chinese civilization long, uninterrupted stretches to develop a continuous administrative and cultural tradition, one that historians often point to as a reason for the remarkable continuity of Chinese script, philosophy, and statecraft across dynastic changes. Compare this to the Fertile Crescent, an open corridor that connected Africa, Asia, and Europe. It was extraordinarily fertile for trade and idea exchange, but it was also a highway for invasion. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, and later Romans all fought over this same strip of land precisely because it was so valuable, and this constant contest for control meant no single civilization could dominate indefinitely. Geography also shaped what a civilization needed to become great in the eyes of history. Mesoamerican civilizations, including the Maya and later the Aztec, developed independently of Old World agricultural staples like wheat and barley. Instead, they domesticated maize, beans, and squash, a nutritional trio sometimes called the Three Sisters by later indigenous North American farmers, and built calendrical and astronomical systems of extraordinary sophistication, partly to manage agricultural timing in a climate far less predictable than the Nile's floodplain. The Mayas' long count calendar and their advances in mathematics, including an early use of the concept of zero, arose from necessity as much as curiosity. But geography alone has never guaranteed greatness. Many regions with excellent farmland or strategic rivers never produced lasting civilizations, and many civilizations without obvious geographic advantages still achieved extraordinary influence. The Phoenicians, for example, occupied a narrow, resource-poor strip of coastline in the eastern Mediterranean, roughly corresponding to modern Lebanon. They had little agricultural land and few natural resources beyond cedar timber and access to the sea. Yet by turning necessity into strategy, the Phoenicians became master shipbuilders and traders, establishing colonies across the Mediterranean, including Carthage, and spreading an alphabet-based writing system that would eventually influence Greek, and through Greek, nearly every European alphabet used today. Their greatness came not from what the land gave them, but from how they responded to what it withheld. This pattern, response to constraint rather than mere accumulation of advantage, recurs throughout history. The early Greek city-states developed in a rugged, mountainous peninsula with limited arable land, which some historians argue pushed Greek communities toward smaller, fiercely independent political units rather than one unified empire. This fragmentation, often viewed as a weakness, may have actually fostered political experimentation, since city-states like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes could each develop distinct systems of governance and compete, sometimes violently, sometimes through trade and culture, for prestige. Athens's development of early democratic institutions in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, associated with reformers like Solon and Cleisthenes, did not happen in a vacuum. It happened within a landscape that made centralized imperial control difficult and local civic participation almost a practical necessity. What these varied examples show is that the foundation of civilizational greatness is rarely the land itself, but the relationship a society builds with its environment. Egypt's predictable abundance encouraged centralized authority and monumental building. Mesopotamia's unpredictable rivers encouraged cooperative bureaucracy and legal codification, as seen in the Code of Hammurabi around 1754 BCE. China's relative geographic insulation encouraged continuity. The Mayas' demanding tropical environment encouraged astronomical and mathematical sophistication. The Phoenicians' resource scarcity encouraged maritime innovation and cultural transmission. Greece's fragmented terrain encouraged political pluralism. None of these outcomes were guaranteed by geography alone. They emerged from the choices, institutions, and adaptations that human communities layered on top of their physical circumstances. This sets the stage for the next essential ingredient of greatness, because a fertile valley or a defensible coastline means nothing without the human systems built to organize, govern, and sustain the people living there. Geography can offer an opening. It cannot, by itself, walk a society through that opening and keep it standing for centuries. That requires something far more fragile and far more human: governance, law, and the ability to hold a diverse population together under a shared idea of order. If geography provides the raw material for civilization, Governance is the architecture that determines whether that material becomes a lasting structure or collapses under its own weight. Throughout history, the civilizations remembered as truly great were rarely the ones with the most territory at their peak, but the ones that solved, even imperfectly, the fundamental problem of how strangers can live together, resolve disputes, and trust a system larger than their own family or tribe. The earliest surviving evidence of this problem being addressed systematically comes from Mesopotamia. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a basalt stele around 1754 BCE during the reign of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, was not the first legal code in history, but it remains one of the most complete and influential early examples. It laid out specific consequences for specific actions, from property disputes to physical injury. And crucially, it was displayed publicly, meaning the law was no longer just the will of a ruler behind closed doors, but a knowable, if harsh, set of expectations that applied, at least nominally, across a wide population. Historians continue to debate how consistently the code was actually enforced, and it applied different penalties based on the social status of those involved. But its existence marks a critical shift. The idea that a civilization's stability could rest on codified rules rather than purely on the personal authority of whoever held power that day. Rome offers perhaps the most studied example of governance as a civilizational engine. What made Rome extraordinary was not merely its military conquest, which was often brutal and opportunistic, but its unusual capacity to absorb conquered peoples into a shared legal and civic framework. The concept of Roman citizenship, which expanded gradually over centuries and was extended broadly to free inhabitants of the empire under the Constitutio Anniniana in 212 CE by the Emperor Caracalla, gave diverse populations across 3 continents a shared legal identity. Roman law, particularly as later compiled under Emperor Justinian in the Corpus Juris Civilis during the 6th century CE, created legal principles surrounding contracts, property, and civil rights that would influence legal systems for the next 1,500 years, including many modern European civil law traditions. Rome's genius was not inventing law from nothing, but building an administrative machine capable of applying consistent principles across a territory stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, a scale of governance that few civilizations before or since have matched. Yet governance is not only about legal codes. It is also about the mechanisms that allow power to change hands without destroying the state itself. This is where many otherwise impressive civilizations faltered. The Roman Empire's later centuries were repeatedly destabilized not by external invasion alone, but by succession crises, civil wars, and the absence of a reliable, peaceful mechanism for transferring imperial authority. The so-called crisis of the 3rd century, between roughly 235 and 284 CE, saw the empire cycle through more than 20 claimants to the throne in 50 years, illustrating how even a civilization with sophisticated law and infrastructure can be brought to the edge of collapse by unresolved questions of legitimate succession. Contrast this with the Chinese imperial system, which, despite repeated dynastic collapses, developed one of history's most durable governing philosophies, the mandate of heaven. First articulated by the Zhou dynasty around the 11th century BCE to justify their overthrow of the preceding Shang dynasty. The mandate of heaven held that a ruler governed with heavenly approval only so long as they ruled justly and competently. Natural disasters, famine, or widespread rebellion were interpreted as signs that heaven had withdrawn its favor, which paradoxically created a built-in ideological mechanism for legitimizing dynastic change without necessarily destroying the underlying administrative and cultural continuity of Chinese civilization. Dynasties fell, from the Han to the Tang to the Song to the Ming, but the bureaucratic infrastructure beneath them, especially the imperial examination system formalized during the Sui and Tang dynasties, which selected government officials based on merit and Confucian scholarly knowledge rather than purely aristocratic birth, persisted and evolved across nearly 13 centuries, from around 605 CE until its abolition in 1905. The examination system deserves particular attention because it addressed a problem that has undone many civilizations throughout history: the tendency of power to calcify around a narrow hereditary elite disconnected from the practical needs of governance. By theoretically opening administrative careers to talented individuals regardless of noble birth, though in practice wealth and family connections still mattered enormously for access to education, China created channels for social mobility and competent administration that helped sustain its bureaucratic continuity across political upheaval. Governance structures that distribute decision-making, even imperfectly, have repeatedly shown more resilience than those concentrated entirely in a single individual. The Iroquois Confederacy, known to its own people as the Haudenosaunee, developed a sophisticated political alliance among 5, later 6, indigenous nations in northeastern North America, likely established sometime between the 12th and 15th century CE, according to varying historical and oral tradition estimates. Its Great Law of Peace established a council structure requiring consensus among member nations, along with mechanisms for conflict resolution designed explicitly to prevent the kind of internal warfare that had previously devastated the region. Some historians have explored the degree to which Enlightenment-era political thinkers, including figures involved in early United States constitutional discussions, may have been influenced by their exposure to Haudenosaunee governance, although the extent of this influence remains a subject of scholarly debate rather than settled consensus. Islamic civilization during its Golden Age, roughly from the 8th to the 13th century CE, similarly demonstrated how governance intertwined with legal and intellectual infrastructure to sustain a vast, culturally diverse empire. Under the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad after its founding in 762 CE, a relatively decentralized administrative system allowed regional governors significant autonomy while maintaining religious and legal cohesion through Sharia-based jurisprudence, developed through multiple competing schools of legal thought. This flexibility allowed the Abbasid Caliphate to govern an extraordinarily diverse population spanning from North Africa to Central Asia, while cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and later Cordoba in Islamic Spain became centers of administrative sophistication and legal scholarship. What unites Rome, Zhou, and Han China, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Abbasid Caliphate is not any single governing philosophy, since they differed enormously in structure, religion, and political theory. What unites them is that each developed institutions capable of outlasting any single ruler's lifetime, absorbing internal conflict without total collapse, and providing enough predictability that ordinary people could plan their lives, raise families, build businesses, and trust that tomorrow would resemble today closely enough to be worth the effort. Civilizations that failed to develop this kind of institutional resilience, no matter how militarily dominant at their peak, tended to be historically brief, remembered more for their conquest than for anything that outlasted them. But governance and law address only how power and order are organized. They do not explain why some civilizations became engines of ideas, art, and innovation that shaped the trajectory of human knowledge itself, while others, despite stable governance, left comparatively little behind in the realm of culture and thought. That distinction brings us to the third pillar of civilizational greatness. There is a particular kind of civilization that history remembers not primarily for its armies or its borders, but for what its people thought, built, questioned, and preserved. This is the civilization that produces philosophy still read 2,000 years later, mathematics still taught in classrooms, medicine that saves lives, and art that moves people across cultures and centuries who never set foot in the land where it was made. This capacity for sustained intellectual and cultural achievement forms the third essential pillar of greatness, and it depends on something governance and geography alone cannot guarantee: a civilization's relationship with knowledge itself. The classical Greek world offers one of history's most concentrated examples of this phenomenon. Within a relatively compact span of geography and time, Greek city-states, particularly Athens during the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, produced a staggering density of intellectual output. Philosophers including Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle developed frameworks for logic, ethics, and political theory that remain foundational to Western philosophy. Playwrights like Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes explored themes of fate, justice, and human folly in tragedies and comedies still performed today. Mathematicians such as Euclid, working slightly later in Hellenistic Alexandria around 300 BCE, systematized geometry in ways that would remain the standard reference for over 2,000 years. What made this possible was not simply individual genius, though genius certainly played its part, but a cultural environment that valued public debate, rhetorical skill, and the deliberate questioning of received wisdom, nurtured partly by the competitive, decentralized political landscape discussed earlier. The transmission and preservation of knowledge proved just as important as its creation. The Library of Alexandria, founded in Egypt under the Ptolemaic dynasty in the early 3rd century BCE, represented an unprecedented attempt to gather the accumulated written knowledge of the ancient world in one place, reportedly employing scholars to translate, copy, and catalog texts from across the Mediterranean and Near East. While much of the library's later reputation has been embellished by legend, and the exact circumstances and timeline of its decline remain debated among historians, its symbolic legacy endures as an early recognition that a civilization's intellectual wealth depends not just on producing knowledge, but on systematically preserving and organizing it for future generations. This principle of preservation and transmission becomes even more visible in the Islamic Golden Age. Beginning in the 8th century CE, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, established under Abbasid patronage, became a center where scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian scientific and philosophical texts into Arabic, often adding substantial original commentary and advancement rather than simple translation. Scholars such as Al-Khwarizmi, whose name is the etymological root of the word algorithm, developed foundational work in algebra during the 9th century CE, a term itself derived from the Arabic word al-jabr, found in the title of his mathematical treatise. Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, compiled the Canon of Medicine in the early 11th century CE, a text that would remain a standard medical reference in both the Islamic world and later medieval European universities for centuries. This intellectual tradition did not exist in isolation. It deliberately absorbed and built upon Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese knowledge, illustrating that some of history's most intellectually productive civilizations were not the most insular, but the most willing to synthesize ideas from beyond their own borders. China's Song Dynasty, spanning from 960 to 1279 CE, offers another striking case of a civilization whose greatness rested substantially on innovation and knowledge rather than territorial dominance alone. Despite facing persistent military pressure from northern neighbors and eventually falling to Mongol conquest, the Song period produced movable type printing. Developed by Shang around 1040 CE, centuries before comparable technology emerged in Europe. Song China also advanced papermaking, gunpowder-based weaponry, the magnetic compass for maritime navigation, and sophisticated water power mechanical clocks. Economic historians have noted that Song China's level of commercialization, urbanization, and technological sophistication in this period was, by many measures, unmatched anywhere else in the world at that time, even though the dynasty is often remembered more for its eventual military vulnerability than for its remarkable innovation. Cultural and intellectual greatness also expressed itself through art and architecture as forms of civilizational memory. The Maya civilization's astronomical observations, encoded into monumental structures like the pyramid at Chichen Itza, demonstrate an integration of scientific observation with religious and civic life. The intricate stone carvings of Angkor Wat, built in the Khmer Empire during the early 12th century CE under King Suryavarman II, encode religious cosmology, dynastic legitimacy, and architectural mastery within a single structure that remains the largest religious monument in the world. In West Africa, the city of Timbuktu, particularly during the height of the Mali Empire in the 14th century CE under rulers like Mansa Musa, became a renowned center of Islamic scholarship, housing extensive manuscript collections covering law, astronomy, medicine, and theology, some of which survive today and continue to be studied and preserved. What these varied examples reveal is that civilizations achieve lasting cultural greatness not simply by producing brilliant individuals, since brilliant individuals appear across nearly every human society, but by building institutions, whether libraries, universities, examination systems, or scholarly networks, that cultivate, preserve, and transmit knowledge across generations. A single genius can produce a remarkable idea, but only a civilization with the infrastructure to record, teach, and build upon that idea can turn a single insight into a lasting intellectual tradition. This is why the fall of a library, the burning of a great archive, or the collapse of an educational institution is so often remembered by historians as more than a material loss. It represents the severing of a civilization's connection to its own accumulated wisdom. Yet even the most intellectually vibrant civilizations have proven vulnerable to forces beyond philosophy, law, and knowledge. Climate shifts, resource depletion, disease, and the simple accumulated weight of internal contradiction have brought down societies that, on paper, appear to have mastered every other element of greatness. Understanding what allows some civilizations to endure these pressures, while others buckle and disappear, requires looking at the final and perhaps most sobering pillar: resilience. If geography, governance, and culture explain how civilizations rise, resilience explains why some of them refuse to fully disappear, even after catastrophic setbacks, while others vanish almost entirely after a single sustained shock. This final pillar is the most difficult to define, because resilience is rarely visible until it's tested, and history is full of civilizations that appeared powerful right up until the moment they collapsed. Few examples illustrate this more starkly than the late Bronze Age collapse, a period spanning roughly 1200 to 1150 BCE, during which numerous interconnected civilizations across the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, including the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittite Empire, and various Levantine city-states, experienced simultaneous and dramatic decline within just a few decades. Historians still debate the precise combination of causes, which likely included prolonged drought, earthquake clusters, disruption of long-distance trade networks upon which these interconnected economies heavily depended, internal social unrest, and invasions by groups referred to in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples, whose exact origins remain uncertain. What makes this collapse particularly instructive is that it did not strike weak or declining societies. It struck civilizations that had been thriving, interconnected, and in some cases at the height of their political and economic power. Their vulnerability lay precisely in their interdependence. When trade routes for essential materials like tin, needed to produce bronze, were disrupted, and when multiple regional crises compounded simultaneously, the tightly linked network of Bronze Age civilizations lacked the flexibility to absorb the combined shock. Contrast this fragility with the remarkable persistence of Egyptian civilization, which endured with periods of fragmentation and foreign rule for roughly 3,000 years, from unification around 3100 BCE through the Ptolemaic period ending with Roman annexation in 30 BCE. Egypt weathered multiple periods scholars term intermediate periods, marked by political fragmentation, foreign incursion, and weakened central authority. Yet each time the underlying cultural, religious, and administrative traditions proved durable enough to support eventual reunification and renewed stability, as seen in the transitions from the first intermediate period into the Middle Kingdom, and again from the second intermediate period into the New Kingdom. This suggests that resilience often depends less on avoiding crisis altogether, since virtually no long-lasting civilization has done so, and more on maintaining enough underlying cultural and institutional continuity that recovery remains possible even after severe disruption. The Maya civilization presents a more complex and still actively researched case of resilience and decline. Rather than a single dramatic collapse, the classic Maya collapse, occurring primarily between the 8th and 9th century CE, involved the gradual abandonment of major lowland cities such as Tikal and Copan, while other Maya centers, particularly in the northern Yucatan like Chichen Itza, continued to flourish for additional centuries. Current archaeological and paleoclimatic research points toward a combination of prolonged drought, deforestation-related environmental degradation, overpopulation relative to sustainable agricultural capacity, and escalating warfare between competing city-states as interacting causes rather than any single explanation. Crucially, Maya civilization did not vanish. Millions of Maya people and their descendants continue to live in the region today, maintaining language, cultural practices, and identity that trace directly back to this ancient civilization. This distinction matters enormously for how historians think about civilizational collapse. The disappearance of centralized political structures and monumental urban centers is not the same as the disappearance of a people or their culture. Resilience also depends heavily on how a civilization manages internal inequality and social cohesion, since external shocks tend to be far more destabilizing when a society is already fractured by internal grievance. The fall of the Western Roman Empire, conventionally dated to 476 CE when the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus, was not the result of a single military defeat, but the culmination of centuries of interlinked pressures, including economic strain from an overextended military, currency debasement and inflation, administrative fragmentation, repeated civil wars over succession, and increasing pressure from migrating and invading groups along its borders, including the Visigoths, whose sack of Rome in 410 CE under Alaric had already signaled the empire's weakening grip. Notably, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered in Constantinople and later known to historians as the Byzantine Empire, survived for nearly another 1,000 years after the Western Empire's fall, finally ending with the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 CE. The Eastern Empire benefited from a more defensible capital, stronger continued trade networks, and a more centralized administrative and military structure, illustrating that even within a single originating civilization, differing institutional resilience could produce dramatically different historical outcomes. Resilience is not solely about surviving catastrophe. It is also about a civilization's capacity to adapt its own core institutions when circumstances change. Japan's response to forced contact with Western industrial powers in the mid-19th century offers a comparatively modern example. Following the arrival of American Commodore Matthew Perry's fleet in 1853, which effectively ended Japan's long period of relative isolation, the subsequent Meiji Restoration beginning in 1868 saw Japanese leadership deliberately study and adapt Western industrial, military, and administrative models while preserving core elements of Japanese cultural and political identity. Within roughly a few decades, Japan transformed from a feudal society into an industrial and military power capable of defeating a European empire, Russia, in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. This rapid and deliberate adaptation illustrates that resilience sometimes requires not rigid preservation of tradition, but the willingness to selectively absorb outside innovation while maintaining a coherent cultural identity, a balance that is remarkably difficult to strike and that many civilizations throughout history have failed to achieve. Taken together, these examples across geography, governance, culture, and resilience suggest that civilizational greatness is not a single achievement, but an ongoing, precarious balancing act. A civilization that masters its environment but never develops durable governance risks internal fragmentation. A civilization with strong laws but no capacity for intellectual growth risks stagnation. A civilization that produces extraordinary art and philosophy but cannot adapt to environmental or economic shock risks catastrophic collapse, as the Bronze Age civilizations tragically demonstrated. And a civilization that survives crisis without maintaining any of its cultural continuity may technically persist, but loses much of what made it worth remembering in the first place. Perhaps this is the real lesson embedded across 6,000 years of human civilization. Greatness was never a fixed possession that a society could achieve once and retain forever. It was, and remains, a continuous negotiation between people and their environment, between rulers and the ruled, between inherited tradition and necessary innovation, and between the fragile achievements of any single generation and the uncertain judgment of all the generations that follow. The civilizations we remember as great are not necessarily the ones that never face collapse, but the ones that left behind something, whether a legal principle, a mathematical concept, a piece of art, or simply a resilient community that someone somewhere, centuries later, found worth preserving.